Is it recording?
Yeah.
For the people that fall asleep, you can watch it online as well. Hello, good afternoon. My name is João Moraes. I'm the first author of a Dataset Similarity Evaluation Framework for wireless communication and sensing. I'm a PhD student from the Wireless Intelligence Lab in Arizona State University. And this work was a joint work with my PhD colleague Sajat in the front row, two great researchers from Interdigital, Akshay Malhotra and Shahab Hamid Ihad, and our PhD advisor, Ahmed Lakati. I hope you enjoy. It is a different work, and so one thing that you might be wondering right in the beginning is why, as a machine learning researcher in wireless, should you care about quantifying differences between data sets? And if I press the right button, yeah, machine learning in wireless is growing quite a lot, the applications. Increasingly more, we have a lot of papers published. And this brings several challenges. The first, it's not just specific in wireless, this is also a machine learning problem in general. There's a struggle to generalize from synthetic data sets to real world. And particularly when you try to deploy in the real world and you train in something that is not real, that you generated, there'll be a performance degradation. And if you can predict this performance, then you can do something about it. And you can have your models perform well in the real world as well. But even if you trained on a data set that is from a real deployment, the real world changes. Networks reconfigure, you can change your antenna tilt, you can change your bands. So soon enough, you might have a mismatch between your real world and your training. And so if you can detect this shift, this data set shift, then you can also either trigger retraining, trigger more data collections. So essentially, using dataset distances, you can use them to predict performance, essentially, and to predict these dataset shifts. The second challenge is efficient augmentation of data, real data, because it's really scarce, particularly in wireless, very tricky to acquire. So if you have a scarce data set and you know the distance to your augmented data set, then you can effectively augment the data. And then the third one is the lack of any standardized benchmarking tools, dataset benchmarking tools. So if I give you a couple of data sets, how can you tell which one is the best to train your model? That still is a challenge in today's machine learning in wireless. So for all of these, distances can help. Distances between data sets can help applying machine learning in wireless. So that's what we're going to talk about, distances between data sets. Previous work on data set distances mainly comes from the machine learning community on the transfer learning and the domain adaptation areas. And they essentially created several metrics to help transfer models trained on scarce data sets to trained on abundant data sets to scarce data sets, which is essentially what we want to do in wireless as well. But the problem is all these metrics, as you're going to see, they don't apply to wireless as straightforwardly as we would like. And you can imagine why, because our wireless channels are different than those examples in the normal computer science communities. So let's have a look at some classes of these distances, and then closer to the end, we're going to see how these apply to how well they predict our performance of the models. So the first class is geometric, which can be, for example, applying point-to-point pairwise distances between two data sets. And usually the Euclidean is very used. And this also has the advantage of you can apply clustering on it, and then on the data sets, different clusters, and then compute pairwise between the clusters. So that's the geometric. The statistical consists on estimating first the distribution of your data in each dimension, and then essentially compare the distances between distributions along each dimension. And then you have the subspace, which consists of projecting your data to subspaces and computing the principal angles and applying some distance on those angles between the subspaces. And the third one, the manifold distances, consists on transforming your data first and then computing your distance after the transformation. To go a bit deeper into what these distances might look like, the first warning is not all metrics are distances, and we are looking for a distance. So there's a lot of metrics that you can find in machine learning, but if you enforce that they need to be positive, because distances usually are not negative, right? And they need to be symmetric, like for instance, A to B is the same as B to A, you can already discard a lot of metrics. And so let's go through those classes fairly quick, just an overview, for you to have some sort of clue of how we're going to apply them. So the geometric distances, they always look like, do I have laser here? Oh, huh. They always look like some sort of sum with some norm there, which can be Euclidean, etc. Statistical, they require estimating the distribution first. You might be familiar, for example, with the Kullback-Leibler, the KL divergence. This one in particular is not a distance. You can even tell, even by the formulation, that it's directional, but you can symmetrize it in a Jensen-Shannon, and that one is already a distance. And you can also divide them in IPMs and F divergences. Essentially, to give you a little intuition about one of the most famous IPMs is Wasserstein, which consists of treating essentially two histograms to estimated distributions as piles of dirt. It's also called the earth mover distance. And then essentially they are different if the more dirt you have to move from one histogram to another place of the histogram to match the histograms. So that's the statistical, that's the Wasserstein. Then you have the subspace, which you will always see as a function of the principal angles there. You might know the Grassmann or the chordal. And then you have the manifold. You might have also heard of the PCA and the Tisny. I'm going to go into more in depth. These slides are also going to be online, don't worry. Also the recording. And then the final, one more distance is the proxy A distance, which essentially consists of applying a classifier to your data set. And the higher the error of your classifier, the smaller the distance, because these data sets that are very similar, you cannot tell them apart, essentially. So all of these have pros and cons, because, for example, this last one requires you to come up with a classifier. So we know all these distances. How are we going to compare them to fairly? And how are we going to correlate them with the model performance, which is what we're trying to estimate? And when I say model performance, what I mean is we have two data sets, we train a model on one, what is the performance on the other? And if we can compute a distance between these two and predict the performance, that would be ideal. It would allow all sorts of applications, like we mentioned in the first slide. So we have three contributions, and that's what I'm going to present here. The first one is a framework for comparing these distances in the first place. The second one, we're going to use the framework to propose two distances that outperform the previous ones we tried in the machine learning community, which is essentially an Euclidean-based, using some KNN clusters, and then one using Wasserstein, both based on UMAP latent spaces. And the third one, we essentially evaluate the many distances and these two in an unsupervised task, because all of these need to be specific to a certain task. And we use a channel state information compression task, which I'm also going to present further. And we show that all of these, the two that we presented, have clear improvements over the other ones. So the framework, how do you compare the distances? Suppose you start with some data sets for a particular task. The first step is to train one model in each data set. Then, with that model, you're going to evaluate it on each other data set. And this will give you a matrix of performances. Actually, performance drops, performance degradations, essentially. You can imagine if you train on dataset 1 and you test on dataset 1, your validation accuracy and your test accuracy should be very, very similar. So practically no performance, and that's why you see zeros across the diagonal. But if you train if you test on a dataset that is very different, then you're going to see a high performance drop. So this is what we're trying to estimate. And to estimate that, we compute distances between datasets. Dataset 1 and 2, for example, we could apply some methods that might be particular to supervised or unsupervised tasks. We might do dimensionality reduction, we might do clustering, and then we apply the distances we talked about. So between each pair of data sets, so it would be like n times n minus 1, but if you repeat, you'll end up also with a matrix. This one is symmetric, because the distances are symmetric, A to B, B to A, right? And we want, essentially, to have high correlation of this matrix here with our distances with the matrix of performances. And a high correlation essentially would have all the points in the same line. So if you have two data sets, data set 1 and 7, you could put the distance here in the x-axis, and you'd have a performance drop in a y-axis if they were perfectly aligned. Now, if you have less than ideal correlations, less than 1, then essentially your performance degradation would be less accurate. You can see that you will have more points there. So the high correlation is a proxy for how well our metric works. And that's the metric we're going to use in the next slides. There are a few non-trivialities, but I'm going to skip them. Essentially, it's not trivial to compare different classes of distances. For example, the statistical ones require a lot of consistency across the estimation of the PDFs. But I'm going to leave it there. Essentially, I'm going to change this part here based on the distance metrics we have. And I'm going to tell you about the data set that we're going to apply this on and the task. And essentially, this part will remain constant, and we're going to change only the distances, and then you'll see how high the correlation is. That's the plan. So the data set. We use a ray tracing data set that we calculated in the Arizona State University campus. This is a 3D data set. It's just the top view. The base station is there in the corner. And here you see like a digital version where we computed our ray tracing, where you see some received signal map, essentially. You can tell it's 3D because, well, that corner is receiving particularly less power. And also the base station here is considered to be beamforming in a DFT codebook fashion. That's why you see the patterns, essentially. This data set is a DeepMinder data set we created with a DeepMinder pipeline. The way we created is we fetched the building information from OpenStreetMaps, we passed it in Blender, where we exported it to Wireless Insight, which is our ray tracing engine. In the Wireless Insight, we computed the paths, essentially, angles, path losses, phases, times of arrival, and we used those path information in a geometric channel to come up with all the channels for all these users, essentially. They are spaced roughly a meter apart, and we enabled everything we could enable in the ray tracer, so as realistic as possible. We have 130,000 data points. 90,000 are outside of buildings. That's the ones we used. And so that's our macro data set. Those n data sets that I showed are going to be 20. And we divided essentially our macro data set in 20 zones. And each of those zones is going to be one small data set with samples within a certain range and with a certain line of sight split between them at a certain height. Yeah. So those are our 20 data sets, which are channels, essentially. The task is CSI compression. If you're not familiar with CSI compression and feedback, if a base station sends a reference signal and to measure the channel, and the user needs to feedback the signal to the base station so the base station can pre-code in a downlink, for example, the channel might be very big. So we compress it. that's the goal of this task, to compress the channel so that the feedback is more efficient. And so the inputs are a channel, 32 base station antennas, the ones we have at the base station, by 32 subcarriers. We further process this channel via 2D FFT to pass it from antenna's frequency to angle domain, angle delay. You see the channel here. It makes it way more localized, which makes it easier to compress slightly. And we use essentially an autoencoder architecture here, inspired on this CSINet Plus, but a bit enhanced. It has some different layers and some better activation functions. And the loss that we train this model with is the NMSE. It's a reconstruction loss, essentially, because we are trying essentially just to get the same channel as we put in the model. And we're going to train 20 of these models, one on each data set, and then we're going to test on each other data set. That's how we get the performance matrices. In the next slide, I'm going to present the results for the distance results that we get from correlating the distances, several of them, you'll see here, with our distance, our performances. Well, immediately, you see that 3 of them perform quite well: Warsenstein, Energy, and PAB. But I think more interesting is to understand why some are better than others. The geometric distances, for example, they struggle here because of the curse of dimensionality. When you have a lot of dimensions, so the 32 by 32, there are more than 1,000 dimensions. It's hard to find the right features that encode the local and global structures in 1,000 dimensions. Many features are noise, essentially. So they are not going to help our distance computation. Then we have the statistical ones. The F divergences, they are actually kept at 1. So the distance is between 0 and 1. And if the distributions don't align, they don't overlap, then you can't quantify the distance anymore. So you can't tell the difference between distributions that are very close, but still different and further apart. But the Warsenstein, if you still remember, it's through Earth moving. So you can still quantify how far they are, even if they don't have common support. And this is general for the other IPMs, except the MMD, which requires a kernel, which is hard to come up with. But in general, the IPMs perform relatively good. The subspace struggle as well, because again, in 1,000 dimensions, you find the subspaces you're projecting into, the angles are not going to be too different. And so it's hard to compute distances there too. And then the PAD, it's actually the best one in this case, with 0.64 correlation, because in high dimensions, it's relative. You can conceive that it's easier to separate data sets. You have more degrees of freedom, let's say. So this is our results from applying what's out there immediately. Can we improve it? And yes, we found a way. Essentially, where do these metrics, why are they suboptimal? They are suboptimal because of the high dimension, which hides the exact features we want for dataset distancing computing. So the structures, local and, but more obviously the global structures, are hidden in the high dimension. So one way of going around this is to change the space to a space where hopefully that it has lower dimensionality and where the features are engineered and more prone for distances that keep the global structure mainly. We care mainly about the global structure. So let's go through a couple of methods very quickly. If you see here, this is our original data set. I colored light blue the line of sight zones, dark blue the non-line of sight. And if we try to compress using PCA, which is a linear, the dimensionality reduction method, you don't see really a lot of, it's not, it focuses on reconstruction, not on preserving global structures. So it's not a great space for computing distances there. TSNE focuses only on local structures. That's why you see a very consistent, locally consistent and nicely 2D space there. By the way, I should mention, we compressed the 1,000 dimensions to 2, and then we colored them again. So this is a very compressed space, of course. We could use autoencoders as well, but with autoencoders, it requires training, it requires the right losses, so not our first approach. And there is a method out there called UMAP, Uniform Manifold Approximation and Projection, which uses topological transformations to go from the high dimensional graph to a lower dimensional. And this, if you parameterize it properly, captures really well the local and global structures. So this is a promising latent space to compute our distances in. And this is what we're going to use, UMAP. And so we apply all those latent spaces and we compute the distances in the latent spaces. And you see here our two proposed distances perform quite well with 0.85. And compared with the other latent spaces that we computed, the UMAP is definitely the most promising one. And then we also included there the autoencoder as an upper bound, essentially. Because the autoencoder with 32 dimensions essentially can reconstruct the whole space almost perfectly. So it's almost as if we are computing distances in the original space, but in less dimensions. So we use it as an upper bound. I think I'm going to skip over some of this. Wasserstein can be more robust in some situations, and I'm also going to skip this. So as a conclusion here, our two proposed distances give a relatively high correlation, and the UMAP latent space is a particular good latent space for computing distances that correlate very well with performance, which enables dataset ranking, many other. So let me conclude. We designed a framework for dataset distancing and prototyping. We proposed two distances using that framework, and we showed those distances outperform the previous ones in terms of correlation with performance. So in this unsupervised case, it works quite well. We should think about future work expanding this to supervised cases. We have a journal coming very soon that used line of sight identification and beam prediction as tasks, and supervised tasks, because most tasks in wireless are arguably supervised. And then another future work would be to actually apply this to end-to-end applications. So can we augment datasets using distances like this? Can we rank datasets? This dataset is better for my task than this other one. Or can we even compress datasets? So I have like 13 datasets. Can I come up with a smaller one that helps me train because it's less data? And this is also useful for benchmarking. So thank you. Let me give you some resources to make this research more accessible to you. We have a web page. The paper is there. The code is commented and also available. There's a reproducibility video to show you how to run the code and get exactly the same results. The dataset is also online. It's a DeepMind dataset. And my contact is also there. This is the page. That's it. Thank you. Looking forward to the questions. Thank you.